Before we dive into today's topic, we want to take a moment to address a sensitive subject that is discussed during this episode. We understand that some of the content we cover today has the potential to be triggering or upsetting to certain individuals. It's important for us to acknowledge the diverse experiences of our listeners and recognize that some topics can evoke emotional responses. We want to create a safe and supportive space for everyone. We encourage you to exercise self-care and prioritize your well-being while listening to this episode. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed, we encourage you to pause, take a break, or even skip ahead to the next segment. Our aim is to approach these sensitive subjects with respect, empathy, and an intention to provide helpful information and support. Lastly, we want to remind our listeners that the views expressed in this podcast are solely our own and may not necessarily reflect the opinions of others. Today on the Idiot's Guide, we're talking about, what's so bad about neighborhood fireworks from the mind of a combat veteran? And if you're ever in the mood for a good old-fashioned plague, why don't you swing on by Elko, Nevada, where most residents are hoping for some seagulls to swoop in and save the day. I'm your host, Adam Richardson, a.k.a. the Prophet Hacker, and I'm joined by the man in charge, Mr. Joe Haslam. Welcome to the Idiot's Guide. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Today's kind of going to be an interesting subject, mainly for the sake that, there's nobody else in the room other than the two of us who originally started this podcast just a couple episodes ago. And so, when we're talking about this concept of interviewing a combat veteran, you're right, it's me. And, this isn't a fun subject for me to be able to talk about or share about. Honestly, if you were to talk to any veteran about that or try to ask them questions about this is not the funnest place they want to be. And so I know that Joe is volunteered so graciously to mostly steer and drive today. So, but I mean, as far as going into this, I want you guys to I want to preface what we talk about today as being aware and being sensitive to other veterans that are out there that this may impact, a trigger warning. Honestly, that's not our heart. That's not our intent, but it is something that could be possible in hearing this. Know that all our goal in what we're doing and talking about today in a little bit more of a serious tone is about the care for those veterans, or the care for our military, and care for those people who have that experience in their life that can be pretty difficult to go through in moments like this. So, Joe, take it away, sir.
All right. Well, when we were looking at topics to go through, generally we try to keep the topics pertinent to what we're dealing with, what's going on in the world, other things that may come up. And as we were getting close to Independence Day, we really wanted to take the month of July and look at military veterans specifically, because there is not a lot of support for veterans. There's a lot of patriotism. People love supporting the troops. But when it comes to what does that actually mean, there's really not as much support, as much help as I think we should have. And so the month of July, we're really going to be focusing our podcast on military. And we're starting that off with this podcast, which is going to go out a few days before the Independence Day holiday, and really talking about the impact of those neighborhood fireworks on the psychological PTSD of veterans. Now, as Adam said, he's not going to be talking a lot, because these are very triggering issues. Any veteran who's come home will have these issues. We talk about PTSD as a specific issue for injured veterans or other veterans that dealt with a little bit more severity. But any veteran coming home is going to have these issues.
Well,
And
and
so-
you know, to preface to that, to kind of amplify what you're saying is, you know, it doesn't even require combat to be able to be exposed to the kind of things that could be a trigger for a veteran. So, you know, for myself, I am a combat veteran, and so I have seen combat. I've been in combat, but training environments, even just training itself, is meant to simulate that sort of real life combat scenario. And for some people, that's just all it takes. That's all it needs to happen is the exposure to that and what it could do to somebody.
Yeah. And so what we're really going to be focusing on today is the psychological training that veterans go through. I know we don't normally think of boot camp as psychological training, but it really is. And so some of my background is in neurocognitive development. So understanding how humans develop neurocognitively, so the neural pathways, how they think, how and why we do what we do, and the impact of that on every person. Specifically over the last few years, I've been working on the impact of that for those that suffer from trauma or PTSD, just because I happen to be surrounded by it a lot. You know, Adam is a combat veteran. I do actually work with some other veterans for whom traditional therapies haven't worked. And so coming up with using this research that I've done to be able to help them get through some of these issues, as well as having foster children who have been traumatized through their early lives. Being able to understand how to help them, how to help them to grow, develop, and become more well-rounded adults. And so that's really where we're going to be going with a lot of the issues today. So first and foremost, when we're talking about neighborhood fireworks, everyone loves their fireworks because it's to the average person, it's a great show of respect for the nation, for patriotism. Star Spangled Banner. We sing about the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, giving proof through the night that our flag was still there. That's why we do fireworks every year, is because this is a sign that we as a nation still exist and still go forward. The problem comes in when veterans are sitting at home and those rockets' red glare, those bombs bursting in air that we as regular civilians enjoy can actually simulate for the veteran those combat conditions and trigger them to be back in those situations. And so it's very hard. The 4th of July, Independence Day, is one of the hardest days for veterans throughout our nation because they get triggered so significantly by flashbacks going into those. And again, like Adam said, it's not just combat scenarios. We're talking boot camp. We're talking even people who are not on the front lines or who are not in active combat, but maybe working in hospitals. These individuals are seeing the impact of these combat situations, even away from combat. And so even though we don't always think about it, remember that these veterans have gone through serious things to keep us all safe. And we need to remember that as the average civilian to understand maybe our fireworks are not the greatest thing to show our patriotism. Now, a lot of veterans, Adam specifically, if he's out there and he sees the fireworks, recognizes that these are just fireworks, it's generally okay.
Right.
It's not 100% okay, but generally it's okay because there's that consciousness within the mind, understanding that I know these are fireworks. I'm not in a combat situation. The problem is when you are letting off those fireworks while a combat veteran isn't seeing what you're doing. And so all they're doing is they're sitting in their home and suddenly they start hearing mortars going off outside their doors. And for anyone who has experienced any kind of trauma, you know that those triggers are significant. And so for a veteran to hear these mortars, even to smell the gunpowder, triggers in their mind these scenarios of they're back in combat. And what that does is it puts them into what I call soldier mode. In that soldier mode, they're now hypervigilant. They are looking for all the scenarios to protect themselves, their families, and anyone that they're around. They are in this mode of, I am watchful, I am aware, and I need to prevent these attacks from happening. And that's what the trigger is. And so they are trained specifically to react this way for protection, protecting themselves, protecting their fellow soldiers. And so when we let off those fireworks, we are potentially causing these veterans that we are supporting, that we are showing our patriotism toward, are actually suffering significantly. And so the one ask that we have, now we'll get into the psychological impact of this or the psychological cause of this, but the one ask we have is be aware. Be aware of the veterans in your neighborhood because they are there. Now, we're not necessarily saying don't do fireworks in your neighborhood. Personally, that would be my choice. But that's coming from a civilian. Adam, being a combat veteran, when we were talking about this, he likes the show of patriotism. It's just really hard for him.
Yeah, I think there's, there is a level. It depends on what state you live in, what access you have to fireworks. We unfortunately live in a state that has really freed up the access to fireworks to an extent. And when I say that, aerial fireworks. Mm-hmm. When it's a little spinning flower on the concrete, or when it's a little sparkler that whistles in the, whatever it is, that stuff is not, it isn't a mortar. But when that thing launches in the air, that sound that it makes when it launches and the sound that it makes when it explodes are very, very unique in the sound that they make. However, they're the same exact sound that they make when it's a real live mortar. And so it's not something you want to, your mind doesn't want to mess around with that. And I want to make this point is that, when we talk about this, I'm pretty sure you're going to touch bases on it later, but the mind doesn't have a timeline. So when we think about these occurrences, to somebody who has a traumatic experience in this field, whether you're military, whether you're police force, whether you're some sort of, I mean, even if it was you were involved in some shootout, I don't know, like anything like that would show some signs of this cataloging in your mind per se. And your mind doesn't put like, well, back in 1982 when I was just a wee lad. No, it doesn't do any of that. It says, hey, this reminds me of the same thing that just happened. It feels like it was yesterday. Why does it feel like it's yesterday? Why is this happening again? And it feels just as real as you were right there just moments before that. And so, keeping that in mind, that when we talk about this stuff showing back up, or these sounds, fireworks per se, it's not because we really are like we haven't addressed something, it's just truly, we have no way, our mind has a hard time separating that or making the distinction between when that actually happened and when it does. But to answer your question, Joe, or to amplify your point, yeah, I don't really mind ground fireworks. I do mind aerials. Typically, my family doesn't know that I try to do this, but when I hear aerials go off, now little bottle rockets, meh, they're not really a big deal. But yeah, the things that go thump and then all of a sudden it blows up in the air, those kind of things are things that I'm looking for. So if I hear somebody launching in my neighborhood, and dude, there are lots of fireworks flexers in my neighborhood, man. They're going to go like just spend probably $4,000 on fire. It like, I don't know. The cars these people drive doesn't indicate the kind of firework purchases that they make. Like, I can't do the math, but that they do. And they spend a pretty penny, and then they have a great show. But typically when those are going off, my kids are ooh and ahhing, and they hear them and they're like, oh, this is awesome. And me, I'm looking for it, because if I can't see it, it's a problem. It starts causing problems in me, and it's subtle. It grows. But for the nights, I mean, even recently, we're coming up on 4th of July, and there are already celebration events. Now, I've learned to get better at identifying like big shows, big firework displays, but yeah, like we haven't started the neighborhood fireworks yet. It's about to, probably end of this week, or like once this episode, like the evening of the episode going live, will probably be the beginning of that. And I can go to a fireworks show all day long. I can see them right in front of me and watch them explode, and that's fine. I can hear the mortars launching, and but some veterans can't even do that.
Right.
So, it's really, it's a tough situation. And it's like, I get a lot of emails right now for my, for my dogs, and everyone's like, oh man, lock your dogs up, put them in something, put them in a bathroom with a fan on, something to play music, just to kind of get them so that they're not just going to bolt down the street when they hear these fireworks and run in every direction because they're going off. Well, but the problem is I haven't gotten one email about veterans.
Yeah.
And that's the sad reality, is that, as we get closer, we'll get some social media posts that go out, and I'll see those. But for the most part, it's more about, hey, keep an eye on your dogs. I was like, no, like, keep an eye on that person that's curled up in a ball in the corner of the house, because they have no idea that that's a fireworks show.
Yeah. It's a sad state of affairs when we care more about dogs than we care about the veterans who put their lives on the line for us. We as civilians are dependent on the military to keep us safe. Now, civilians may have, a whole stockpile of guns, have other, skills and things to keep themselves safe should something happen. But to be honest, that's worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Those frontline soldiers are the ones keeping us safe and keeping America from running into a lot more problems. And so remember the veterans, remember what they've done for us, and think about them first when it comes to these firework events. In addition to that, when your local jurisdictions say fireworks should end at a certain time, end at a certain time. Because some veterans do have great coping skills. So they'll do certain things, they'll do certain activities that help them to get through that. And then once it ends, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, they think they're safe. And then if they suddenly start hearing those things going off again, it sends them into an even worse situation. So we ask you, please, when the fireworks are meant to end, please end them. Share this with as many people as you know, because this is a really, really important topic that we get out there. These are real people. These are real people who have gone through very serious situations, and we need to honor them for what they've sacrificed for us. Okay. So now let's get into why veterans get so triggered with these events. And so first and foremost, what we have to talk about is how the brain functions when it comes to a matter of environmental factors. Okay. So the brain works within triggers, and those triggers are designed to help us function more efficiently. So in my research, I call them neural anchors because I think that's just a better term than trigger, because trigger always has such a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
And so by looking at these as simply neural anchors, so these are strong points within the brain that force us to act a certain way. Think about if you were in the savannah and you see a tail come up out of the grass. Well, that's going to trigger you that that's a lion, you need to run. That is the animalistic brain that we have, the very instinctual side of the brain that we don't have time to think, is that a lion? Is that maybe something else? Could that just be the wind? Is it this? Should I pet the kitty? Our instinctual brains trigger us to respond in order to keep us alive. And so throughout our lives, our brains develop these neural anchors so that in any given situation, we respond the most efficiently way possible. And so we have a lot of these. The one that I love using is a very simple word. It's common amongst almost all nations in the world, all languages, and that word is mom. As soon as I say that word, anyone that hears it is going to have specific thoughts, memories, smells, all these different things that come up just from that one word. That's one of the strongest neural anchors because everyone has a mom. Whether your mom was there for you or not, everyone has a mom. Mm-hmm. And so it creates that strong neural anchor that you live by. As we go through life, we develop other neural anchors depending on what experiences we have in life. When we're talking about veterans specifically, when they go through boot camp, they are essentially stripped down of all their pre-existing neural pathways and then rebuilt as soldiers. Now, we're talking about a neurological standpoint. And so all of these things that they've developed over time are taken away and then rebuilt so that they react a very specific way to specific triggers. So when their superior says, do this, there is no thought. They do that. And the old adage you say, when I say jump, you ask how high. It's not how it works. When your superior officer says jump, you jump as high as you can. There's no asking how high. And so this idea of these soldiers are trained to respond. They have built these neural anchors into their brains to respond a specific way.
I want to inject something here to the conversation. You use the word soldier, and I say this only in the sense that you're a civilian.
Yes.
And I know that there might be. I'm going to share probably this episode with quite a few. I'm a chapter commander for the Disabled American Veterans, and so I have a network of people that this episode will get shared with. But the Marines. The Marines are not soldiers. They will correct you first and foremost. The first time you say soldier, you're like, excuse me, you aren't addressing Marines anymore. So just say, hey guys, from my perspective, I'm nodding in that direction saying, you guys are included in this information and what we're talking about today. But in Joe's case, he comes from another direction from this. And so, just give him some grace when he uses soldier, and please include yourself.
And the reason I use soldier is because for the layman, not for the veteran, but for the layman, when I explain these things, so when I explain these to psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, all those kinds of things, most of the times they're not veterans either. And so everyone understands the term soldier to mean any military personnel. And so I apologize if I do offend anyone by using the blanket term soldier. That is the layman's terms. Adam does correct me quite often when I make a mistake.
It sound so aggressive. I won't do it again.
But I mean all military personnel. Is there a common term for military personnel?
Military personnel.
Other than military personnel?
Veteran.
other than veteran? Because veteran connotes someone who's come home, again, to the layman.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's active or veteran forces, you know? So military personnel is typically like the most politically correct term you can say that covers all spaces there. So
Sounds good. Because I think airmen or Air Force are not called soldiers either. They're airmen.
Yes.
Marines are simply called Marines.
Yes.
Army is soldiers.
Yeah.
And
Navy is sailors.
Sailors.
Space Force, I have no idea. Airheads.
Yeah, I'm not sure Space Force.
I don't know if there's a veteran yet in the or
yeah. And then Coast Guard, is there a?
I'm not sure about,
Okay. Yeah.
Generally military is, if you just use the word military, our military forces, that's a good blanket term.
Yeah. So I will continue to use soldier. Just because military makes it sound a little too formal. Again, my normal communication is not necessarily when I speak to veterans, when I talk to veterans, when I work with them.
You could use service members.
I try to use as formal terms as possible.
Okay.
When I'm talking to the lay person, such as the majority of our listeners will be on this podcast, I do use the term soldier because that is generally what people understand a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't mean it as a term of exclusion, just simply because more people will understand.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail where we were going, but I had to make that distinction. Otherwise, we're going to lose part of the audience.
Well, and again, this comes back to honoring veterans.
Yes.
We have to show them respect. Now, hopefully, that term will be more accepted. Military personnel just sounds a little too formal. It's a little hard to military personnel mode from a psychological perspective. It just doesn't roll off the tongue.
It sounds official, like, oh yeah, we've moved in, we've activated, this level of military personnel to be, over this region of, whatever. It sounds very much like government wise, you know.
So if any veterans are listening to this, if you want to leave in the comments or send us a note or anything about a term that you feel would be better fit for my psychological perspective here. So again, I'm talking about soldier mode. This is the training that veterans are put through in boot camp so that they act as effectively and efficiently as possible while in the field. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, and it's a really important thing as we continue to talk about this. This, again, soldier mode there is no moving out of that. Once you are a veteran, you are always a veteran.
Well, and I think, also once you are trained to be reactive in in those environments, they don't untrain you.
Right.
They don't teach you a different skill to be back more like a civilian. You now have that ingrained in you as a neural anchor that, when there's a fire, you're supposed to run to it, and it's really hard to change that. So,
yeah. And when we talk about, veterans coming home, and we call a lot of issues PTSD that are not necessarily PTSD. When the average civilian is interacting with a veteran, if the civilian starts getting angry or upset, I don't know, am I allowed to say the word Karen? I think it's Ken is now the male version. Kens and Karens.
Really? Ken? I like that. I haven't heard that one. I've always heard Kevin, but
maybe it's Kevin. I don't know. But when they start getting upset and irate and angry, well, a soldier, when they are confronted in the field, reacts as a soldier does. Mm-hmm. When a veteran, again, using the common term soldier, when a veteran comes home, there is no boot camp to make them back into a civilian and react as a civilian would. And so they continue to act exactly like a soldier would. And so in these escalating environments, the veteran becomes escalated and reacts exactly as a soldier should.
Yeah.
Not as a civilian should, but as a soldier should. And so we as civilians generally call that PTSD. They are reacting aggressively. They are flashbacking to these scenarios.
Or in the workplace, they call it an HR violation.
Right, yeah, exactly. When in reality, these specific situations are not the result of PTSD. PTSD is something completely different. These interactions where they get angry, where they get aggressive, where they become more...
I'd say direct in their
yeah,
tone.
that's the word I was looking for. Direct with their words and posture. That is exactly what one would expect from a veteran. Mm-hmm. That is exactly what you are trained to do as veterans. But as civilians, we get scared because we've got this guy who is super muscled and is looking down on us in that direct, stern tone, and it creates fear. And we generally associate that because we want to feel normal as you're being over aggressive. And that's not the case at all. All this is that veterans have been trained to be this way. And there's no boot camp to help them come back down to a civilian level. Okay. So remember this when you're interacting with veterans, is that they are always in soldier mode. So again, veterans out there, if you've got a better term for this than soldier mode, please let me know. I will change it in all my literature.
My family used to call it my switch, which makes it sound like I have multiple personality disorder.
Right.
But yeah, like and don't misunderstand the way Joe is explaining this. It's not like, hey, this guy is always a jerk, although there's some truth in that too. It's mainly the fact that there's an intensity about military, about service members that are that is different, that you can kind of sense and feel. It doesn't mean that person is being mean or rude. There's in my case, I can speak for myself. It's hypervigilance. It's near trying to hold back a near panic attack because I'm standing in a grocery store, like those kinds of things. So you have, avoidance issues and things like that. So, those are all kind of environments that we are always in our everyday life. All of us are in normal everyday scenarios. However, having this extra kind of trained insurance policy that our service members have is part of that. It plays a big role into the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we talk, the way we communicate, the way we respond to things, the way that we feel. And the way that, it'll come across as insensitive because we're not crying when you are, all those sorts of things. And we just say things pretty unvarnished,
Yeah. And so a few years ago, I was working with a veteran for whom traditional therapies didn't work. He was a service member for a lot of years. I think it was 25 years. And he had been home for, I think, 15 years at this point. He had a hard time dealing with a lot of home stuff. I mean, going out, even to the mall, going out to dinner, were hard things for him because in those environments, he was back in those combat zones. He was in soldier mode all the time, always looking for the escape routes. And so in working with him, after about 9 months, I was able to work with him to be able to switch back and forth between civilian mode and soldier mode. And all we did was retrain these neural anchors to respond differently and more like a civilian would respond, as opposed to how a soldier would respond. Now, I didn't want to get rid of the soldier mode because that's really important. If a veteran wants to go back in the field, if the veteran wants to be a civilian contractor, if they lose this soldier mode, they're no longer able to function at their best capacity as a military asset.
Mm-hmm.
And so working with him, and he shared a lot of insights when it came to switching back and forth between the soldier and civilian mode. And in that soldier mode, just so that the rest of the civilians listening to this podcast can understand, when he's in that soldier mode, he is looking for all possible escape routes. He is mapping, and this is all instinctual. None of this is, it's like walking. You don't think about walking, you just walk. You want to get somewhere, you walk there. There's no conscious thought that goes along with it. This is how military personnel function when it comes to this quote unquote soldier mode. And so when he's in soldier mode, he looks for every possible exit. He is watching for all possible routes of incoming combatants. Mm-hmm. He is looking, his brain actually processes all of the unimportant information less, and it heightens the processing of all of these possible areas. He's looking at all individuals. He is looking at their posture. He is looking at their movements, watching every small bit and piece. I can see Adam's eyes starting to trigger to some of these things that I'm talking about as I'm saying this. It's not Adam that I was working with. It was another veteran, but this is what they all go through. They are constantly watching for threats. And this is what they are trained to do, because in a combat zone, you can't be passive. You cannot sit idly by, because if you are idle, you may die. Mm-hmm. That's how serious it is. This is not just a matter of going out to the grocery store on the weekend and looking out for a car as you're going through the parking lot. This is literal life and death situations that these guys, men and women, are dealing with every single day.
You know, they do this thing when I was in combat, that before we would leave the camp, we would have basically a threat assessment. And the threat assessment was just kind of evaluating where the hot areas are, the different areas that we were traveling through, what's going to be the highest threat in those areas. What are we looking for? And so what I found is years later, and I don't understand like what Joe's saying. This is not something that I'm doing on purpose. I'm not thinking like, man, it's hard for me not to do something like this. And it almost, I don't know how to explain it. It almost makes it so that I can feel better about where I'm at in the situation. If I run into a place where I'm triggered, I will threat assess. And that comes down to all the things that Joe listed. The sad part is when I come back into reality in that situation, it's an 80-year-old grandma that I'm threat assessing. And I'm like, this is a freaking joke. And I feel like, in my head, then I turn on myself and I go like, what kind of person am I? That I get a trigger, and that, please understand that in the situation, a service member is trained to protect you. And so they're not seeing you as a bad guy. They're seeing an environment that they see everything around them and evaluate that as danger. But that doesn't necessarily call you the bad guy. So their reaction isn't going to be attack this thing. It more so is this mental process and conflict that's happening, where they're trying to bring themselves back to where they are in the present, where they're also dissociating and still there in the combat zone. And so that war, that conflict that's happening is just the timeline conflict. It's not you as a civilian in the process. The best thing that you can do for somebody, if you recognize that they're shut down and looking around, is just let them do their thing. Don't go and try and engage, because they will tear your head off, but care and concern. is the biggest thing. Is just be aware where they are and wait that out with them, because that storm is big in their head right now.
Yeah. And remember, we're talking about psychological training here. This is what allows soldiers to do what they do. That is vital to what they do. That's why they go through boot camp. That's why they go through all this extra training. And so we as civilians need to show our support to these veterans by recognizing these issues and recognizing what's going on in their brains. If we go back to that lion example, these veterans are not trained to run from that lion like we are as civilians. Veterans are trained to go toward that lion and head it off so that the rest of the tribe can run away and be safe. That's what they're trained to do. And that's what they do every single day of their lives. Back home, it's harder because there are a lot of situations they're always on the lookout for that lion. They're always watching out to protect their fellow soldiers, which is their family, the people that they're with. That's what they're looking out for. And this is trained into them. This isn't a choice. This is their training. Okay. Now, talking about PTSD, I know we're going a little long today, but talking about PTSD takes it a little further in that these are not pre-trained psychological responses. These are responses that are trained into the brain because something has happened that they now need to reprocess their existing reactions. And so if they acted a certain way and something bad happened or not the ideal situation happened, then the brain is going to automatically revert to an instinctual method to find until it finds a new, better option of reaction. That's PTSD. We see this in anyone who's traumatized, whether it is veteran, whether it is children in foster care, whether it is domestic violence. Any of these situations, this is the psychological reactions of PTSD. The brain is simply reprocessing those neural pathways in order to survive because the existing scenarios, the existing reactions did not work. And so when you've got veterans at home and they have been traumatized, their brain is cataloging everything that happened in that scenario. It could be the position of the sun. It could be a smell. It could be any possibility for a sound. Anything that occurred during that moment that is then triggering the brain to say, this is happening. I need to react because last time when I did something else, something bad happened. And so I need to respond this new way. That's PTSD. And so when veterans hear these fireworks, when all of these things are going on, they can't consciously recognize that these are fireworks. Like Adam said, sitting in the stands watching the fireworks, that's different for him. Again, not all veterans can do that. But understanding that when those things happen, these are psychological responses that are built into the brain to keep us safe. They are there so that we as a human species can survive. And the veterans have been through so much hell that their brains are triggered and trained and retrained through trauma to react to those situations in order to protect their survival. This is the way that the brain functions. And we need to recognize that and honor the veterans by understanding how their brains work, understand that these are not diseases. These are not strange, random problems with the brain. Their brains work. This is the way that the brain is meant to work. They've just been through hell that we as civilians can't even come close to understand. And so we as civilians tend to call them ill because of it. And we need to stop looking at veterans as ill and look at ourselves and see, how are we treating the veterans around us? How are we responding to them? How are we helping them instead of just dismissing them? And that is the most important thing. We have to understand the psychological underpinnings of why they act the way they do and understand it's our responses, our decisions that need to change. It's our involvement in their lives.
Well, I'm not saying that, well, you know, I think asking a society to adjust the perspective, I would say, about, you know, the stigma behind or the stigmas behind PTSD or other trigger responses. It's I want to say this is it's not just on that side. I think that, you know, with PTSD or with any sort of trauma, like one of the things that you mentioned is that this neural anchor or neural pathway is something that can be cared for. And I don't want to say completely removed from somebody because I don't know yet personally, but I've heard people, you know, I've heard of those stories where, you know, these sensitivities to specific environments have been so, you know, so removed from a major emotional response that they aren't a big impact anymore. That you can sit in your back patio and listen to fireworks going off everywhere around you, but and be fine with it and not bat an eye. I'm going to say this though, the percentage of those people who are to that point is very few and far between. The majority is the other, and the other is that this is a hell, and this is something that, you know, it's not saying, hey man, you need to adjust your celebrations to accommodate me. You know, your patriotism's too loud. You know, like
I'm just going to cut in here. That is a true veteran right there. You know, they put themselves in harm's way every single day, and they will not be the ones to stand up and say that we need to change because they are the most selfless, the most sacrificing individuals in our society. Okay. And so when Adam comes in and he says, you're okay continuing your celebrations, you're okay continuing your things, you're okay continuing the way you are, that's because he is allowing himself to be self-sacrificed for the rest of us. So just remember that as you listen to this. Two different perspectives. You've got Adam, the veteran, who has sacrificed for a lot of his life and continues to sacrifice. Me, as his friend, seeing what he goes through and seeing what society does to him. It's hard for me to live with that and understand that we don't put him on a pedestal. Now, I'm not saying that we should, like Adam said, we shouldn't completely change everything, but we need to understand the psychological impact and recognize their importance, recognize what's going on.
Yeah, don't demonize it. Don't turn us into monsters because we think we're monsters already, you know. And there is care, there is treatment out there for veterans and for our service members that has, you know, and it's ever growing. I just learned about a new avenue over the weekend that a news article did. That I'm like, wow, that sounds pretty cool. I should probably explore that. But a lot of it is still always kind of with neuroscience. It's very, very trial and error. And sometimes that error is really devastating. But know that like, this is not something that any service member wants to subject their, you know, their loved ones that subject anybody in society to. But you'll be, I mean, you're grateful because we stand with you. We stand in that same crowd. And when stuff hits the fan, you guys can take off. We will run toward it. And that's okay. Like that's something that all of us who are service members signed on a dotted line that said we are willing to do this and be subjected to that ourselves. But that's not the end of the road. That's not the end of what we are. I think it's thoughtfulness and grace and allowing the those people that are around you, recognizing they are your loved ones. They are the people you care about. They care about you deeply and loyally, and 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 hope that that's reciprocated when they send you to safe places so that they can fight that for you. That's the mentality that a service member is going to be. It's trained into them, and but the treatments that are out there, I hope, and I'll add some links to this episode here so that there's avenues to explore and things to look into, for possibly anybody who's listening who has a loved one that deals with this, or is one of those individuals that dreads the upcoming holiday, and or any other time. I mean, there are moments that Christmas, during Christmas time, shopping is really, really terrifying. And I, if I sat down with a normal, just everyday person, they go like, I don't get it. Like, I mean, I understand. Like, I probably got in a couple fights with some Karens and Kevins too, but I'm like, yeah, but yeah, I can't even fight. Like, when I'm struggling to find a parking stall, there's the stress level kicking up. And so I walk into a madhouse and I'm like, I can't stay here. I can't even be here. Like, I'm going to go at 3:00 in the morning because I would rather shop at that hour than be around in public. And guys, this isn't a new thing. This is something that my grandfather did the same thing. If he had to go to the store, he would go in the middle of the night because that was the safest time that he felt he wasn't going to have a panic attack. And it's being mindful of it. It isn't, it isn't necessarily, changing a demeanor or changing the way that you approach this. Change the way you think about it. Change the way that you feel about it, that it's not a monster that you're staring at, that it's a human being that's trained to help you. And they might need a little bit of help so that they're not stuck in a combat zone or stuck in a training environment, something trauma that's triggering them. But yeah.
Hard subjects today. Now, gosh. I do want to make, Adam said this a couple times. This is hard for veterans to talk about. One, because they are just so selfless that they don't ever want to focus on themselves. Two is that everyone has a hard time when it comes to talking about mental health. Mm-hmm. And we need to remove those stigmas on mental health. And veterans are no different when it comes to not wanting to talk about mental health. And so for Adam, I was the one that wanted to address this. Adam also wanted to talk about this, but he really didn't want to actually be talking.
I didn't think it was a podcast episode. It was just, we've had these conversations before.
And so Adam has really put himself out there today to talk about this. And so I really want to thank him for sharing his perspectives on a lot of this, because we don't hear enough from veterans talking about this for both of those reasons. And so...
My pleasure.
So hard subjects today. And now I want to hear Adam's transition into...
Oh man, I don't know if I'm going to have a very great transition today. Okay, so I'm just going to dive into it. Let's shift gears. If you could imagine 11 plus years of aging, let's say that, like marinating in whatever you want to call this environment. This will lay dormant for nearly 11 plus years, but then all of a sudden you have this drought that happens, and the drought is covering the western half of the United States, and it dries everything out, and everyone's like, are we ever going to get water again? And then all of a sudden this winter just dumped, and then we get a whole bunch of water, a really wet spring, and what happens? You have a late bloom of something called the Mormon cricket. The Mormon cricket, and the reason why it has its name like that is because, there's a state bird in Utah named the state bird because of the Mormon cricket, and they are actually not crickets. They are, there's something completely different than a cricket. But the story about it, why it became a Mormon cricket, is because there was an infestation over Utah and I'm going to guess the Salt Lake area. Mm-hmm. And that infestation was more like a giant wave plague of this huge little, like up to the size of a thumb. Like they're like 3 inches. I don't know. My thumb's not quite 3 inches. Pretty close. 2.5 inches. That's still really big. Okay. You see a cricket come running around, running after you, and you're like, run for your life. You know? That is that's the scene back in, I don't even know when this was, back in the 1860s, something like that. But anyway, Days of 47, so 1847.
There you go. Yeah, I guess that is.
I got to do the math good. But the seagull came swooping in and ate up all the crickets that were all over the place. And they'll call it the plague of locusts. So, maybe it's a locust. They all have hopping legs and they make noises and all that kind of stuff. Guys, it's actually called a shield-backed katydid. It's not a cricket. It's not a locust. It's a katydid. They can't fly. They literally crawl everywhere. And these Mormon crickets currently are taking over Elko, Nevada. The reason why I said 11 plus years is because they will stay dormant. Their eggs will stay dormant in the dirt for years and years, over 11 years. And then when you have this perfect environment of a dry drought season, and then it dumps a whole bunch of water, more of those eggs than normal hatch. And you have oceans of crickets all over the place, and their blood red shells are just terrifying. So you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you see the road shift, and you're, they're literally having like skids. Like it's like black ice on the road. Not only is it like black ice, but it also sticks to your tires, and these guys are cannibalistic. So they smell horrible, and they, like, I would say, like, if you could do anything, like, I would try to harvest them and cook them into something, but then I'm like, that meal would smell disgusting. Kind of like goat milk, like, yeah. But I don't know. I'm not a goat milk fan, but I thought about that. I was like, maybe that's the case, like they just need to figure out a way to cook them all. But they're in Elko, Nevada, so it's warm and it's hot. So they're already cooking and they're not cooking. So they're just a giant red ocean covering highways, wow. Cars skidding out of control, sliding off the road because they've gone over this river of katydids. And I mean, that's kind of terrifying and gross. It smells gross. Like, I don't want to visit there. Like, it sold me on never going to Elko, like, ever.
That I mean, the way you're describing that is modern day plague, right there.
Right? Yeah. So if you're in the mood, like I said, if you're in the mood for a good old fashioned plague, cruise on down to Elko, because right now they are covered in it, and wow. It's just gnarly. They actually, one of the hospitals, it was an article from one of our local news channels here, KSL News, and they were talking about 4 new employees that were hired, and they're literally called the Cricket Patrol because their job is to clear the entryway just enough to where they can get patients in and out. Wow. That's how bad. I mean, like, it's insane. It covers everything. Oh, it makes my skin crawl right now. I feel like there's bugs in the room now. So the only thing that I can say about this is there is nobody laughing at jokes in Elko.
There might have been a joke in there. I didn't get it.
Because of the crickets. Come on.
Oh, got it. The chirping.
Yeah, just crickets. It's
all
just
right,
crickets.
There you go.
So nobody's
Lots
laughing.
of chirping.
Yeah, I'm sorry I had to unpack that and even say it. It was really that sad. I was looking for cricket jokes, but unfortunately there's no cricket jokes.
Oh, bummer.
You know why?
Why?
Because it's crickets.
These are like dad jokes are lame.
Near swing and a miss.
These are below dad jokes at this point. These are wow. That's wow.
Yeah. So if you're in Elko, Nevada, it's no joking matter. Can I keep going?
I think you've beaten the dead horse
Okay,
here.
all right, that's fair enough. Well, guys, that's all we have. That's all I can take for the day. I'm pretty sure I've also beat Joe to death with some cricket jokes, and I hope he enjoys that. But thank you guys for joining us. We're gonna continue this through the month. Not so intense about necessarily the psychological ramifications of fireworks, but to a veteran. But we will stay in the lane of some of our military personnel, some history, some information about that, because it deserves that. I honestly think that that this month would have been a better month than May for Military Appreciation Month, or Military Pride Month, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it. Like, in the sense of, this is probably one of the most patriotic months of the year, and honestly, did anybody even know that May was, back in '99, made into the month to appreciate military? Because honestly, no, nobody does.
I had no idea.
Because everybody celebrates and thanks the military and appreciates them during the month of July.
Yeah.
And so it goes to say, like, hey guys, it doesn't take a motion from the government to be able to say thank you. It just takes your face hole to say thank you. So do us all a favor, appreciate a veteran, and if you see one wearing a hat that says what they did, appreciate that they're home. Welcome them home. And that's all I got for the day. Did you want to sound off with anything else?
Nothing from me.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. And in fashion of what we're talking about this week or this month, we'll sound off with a little bit different normal sign off than normal. Check your boots. We understand that mental health crises can occur, and it is crucial to have the right resources and support available when needed. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger or experiencing a mental health emergency, please reach out to someone. In the U.S., you can dial 911 or contact your local emergency hotline. There are additional hotlines and crisis centers available that can provide immediate assistance 24/7. Organizations such as National Suicide Prevention Hotline, Lifeline, Crisis Text Line, or local crisis hotlines in your area are valuable resources to consider. Links are also found in the bottom of the show notes. Please remember that this podcast is not a substitute for professional help. We aren't even trained mental health professionals. Mental health is just as important as physical health, and seeking support is a sign of strength and courage. Lastly, we want to remind you that the information shared in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. If you're seeking advice or assistance, please consult a qualified mental health professional or healthcare provider. Thank you for listening and being part of our community. Now let's continue to raise awareness, reduce the stigma, and support one another on our mental health journeys. Cheers.